My name is Dagmara Bożek-Andryszczak, and today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the first Antarctic expedition, international one, but it is called Belgian Antarctic Expedition. What were the aims of that expedition? What were the successes? Because it's very important, and what was written in the diaries of Roald Amundsen, that was a member of the expedition. Okay, so we can switch to the presentation right now. At first, we should start with the Belgica, the ship that was famous because on its board the expedition reached the Antarctic. So it was called Belgica, but the first name was Patria. The ship was built in Norway in 80s. Remember that we are now in the end of the 19th century, so over 1 century ago, because it was the very beginning of the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. I hope that some of you will have an opportunity to participate in the lesson about the Ernest Shackleton in English. Maybe it will be organized in English, because yes, without the Belgica, there will be no Shackleton. Of course, I'm joking, but the rest of the polar explorers based on the achievements of that Antarctic expedition. So the Patria was a whaler. It is the kind of a ship that was used to hunt for whales in the Antarctica and in Arctic. And after that, it was bought by Adrien de Gerlache and became a research vessel, and it was called Belgica. Because of the Belgium, Adrien de Gerlache came from Belgium, and the main patron of the expedition was the Belgian Geographical Society. So without the financial support from that society, I think that expedition couldn't take place because they have not enough money to organize it. So when de Gerlache obtained the research vessel, he decided to look for this stuff. So of course, all of they known very well that the expedition will be Belgian, because it was the main aim of the whole organization. But de Gerlache decided as well to invite for the participation many famous scientists from different countries. So the expedition took last for 2 years. It's a very long period because we shall imagine that during that times the knowledge about the Antarctic was very poor among people. So they didn't know a lot about that continent, about the weather condition and so on. There were not efficient maps on the polar regions. So spending almost 2 years in the cold climate was a challenge. But that was not the aim of that expedition because they didn't expect it. We will discuss it later on. So important is that the leader of the expedition was Adrien de Gerlache, and we should know that it was a very, very, very important event in the history of polar exploration, because that was the very first expedition organized in such scale to the Antarctic. So it was even like the very patriotical event. People were very happy because the Belgian scientists and sailors went to the Antarctica. So it was something unusual and something very unique. And the captain of the vessel was Georges Lecointe, the Frenchman, and they both organized the whole expedition. But they were not leaders during the whole expedition. I will tell you about it later on. And we had 23 members of the expedition. It's the official numbers. Why? Because they left Antwerp with 23 people on board, but there were some personal problems, for example, in Southern America, when some sailors were dismissed because of the lack of subordination, or, for example, the cook was not a good cook, so the Gerlache decided to remove him and replaced by the other person. So that's why the numbers were a little bit changing, but yeah, we all should know that it was about 20 people on board, and we have 13 people from Belgium, 6 Norwegians, 2 Polish scientists, 1 scientist from France, and 1 from Romania. So you can see that that was a really international expedition, but of course the country that organized and financed the whole event was Belgium. And there was Nansen, the cat, on the board. The Nansen, of course, in the name of the Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian famous polar explorer. And Nansen belonged to Johan Koren. He was the member of the expedition. And that animal played a very important role because, you know, if you like animals and have a pet at home, it's always nice if you have a cat or a dog or, I don't know, a guinea pig or something like this, because the atmosphere is different. So the same was on board during the expedition. Unfortunately, the Amundsen didn't write so much about Nansen in his diaries, only that they had terrible problem with him because he ate all of the fishes they collected to take as a samples to the Europe. So they had to keep an eye on the cat because he was fancy of the fishes and other samples, scientific samples, let's say. Okay, so as I told you, there are members from many countries, so I will only focus on some of them because it's difficult to describe every person from the 20 people staff, but we have Emil Rakovita, a very famous Romanian scientist, zoologist, speleologist. We have Roald Amundsen, yes, it was the same, who as a first reached the South Pole in 1911. I compete with the Robert Falcon Scott, who didn't succeed in that competition, unfortunately. And it's important that Amundsen obtained very efficient experience during the expedition on Belgica ship. He was young, he observed a lot the situation, write down some observation about the atmosphere on the board during the wintering, and that's why he furthermore known a lot about organizing and survive during the polar expeditions. And we have the Frederick Albert Cook. He joined the expedition in Southern America and acted as a doctor on the Belgica ship, and he was the explorer as well. Maybe some of you heard about that famous conflict between Frederick Cook and Robert Peary, who as a first person reached the North Pole, and I think that till nowadays the conflict has any solutions who was the first, because it's very hard to to say there were many facts about those two expeditions, but yeah, he had some ambitions to travel, to explore many countries, new lands, so that's why he was on board with the Gerlache. And for me, it's very important, and I think that we have some participants from Poland as well enrolled for that lesson. We have two Polish scientists as well on board. It's very important because Arctowski and Dobrowolski were the first Poles that explored the Antarctic. So yes, the beginning of the Polish scientific research in that region is very firmly connected with Arctowski and Dobrowolski. And the Amundsen wrote about the Arctowski in his diaries, something like this: Arctowski would act as a geologist, oceanographer, meteorologist, and glaciologist, a task which today would be divided up among at least 4 specialists. Arctowski was a geologist, geophysicist, and glaciologist, and on Belgica he worked as a meteorologist and was responsible for regular daily meteorological observation. And we have Antoni Bolesław Dobrowolski. He was a geophysicist and meteorologist, and on Belgica he helped Arctowski with the measurements. He was a meteorological assistant. Important theses and observations made by those two scientists was that Arctowski supposed that the Antarctic Peninsula from the whole land with the Andes Mountains. It was the hypothesis, and the further research confirmed that. So his observation was right, and Antoni Bolesław Dobrowolski is author, let's say, of the new discipline. It's cryology. It's a hydrology of ice that is focusing on some researches connected with the role of the water in natural environment in frozen state, like sea ice or permafrost, for example. And he's the author of many important scientific works, but the main is the natural history of ice from 20s. It's important that till nowadays, we have Poland has 2 research bases in the Antarctic. The first is Arctowski Polish Antarctic Station. It is located in King George Island, in archipelago of South Shetland Islands, near the southern edge of Antarctic Peninsula. It has worked since 70s. So this year it celebrates the 4th anniversary of the beginning and acting in the scientific field in the Antarctic. I had an opportunity to spend 1 year working in that station, and in the beginning of November there will be 1 year when I came back home from that expedition. And the second interesting place is Dobrowolski Antarctic Station. That was a station that belonged to the Soviet Union, and the end of the 50s. They given us as a, let's say, country that we have some connections, maybe not the friendly ones, unfortunately, but political ones. They gave us that station as a gift, let's say, and Polish scientists had used it for 20 years. In the end of 70s, they decided to close the station, but still it belongs to Poland. There are no works done there because as you can see, it's not in very good condition, but maybe it will be used again. It's hard to say, but we will see. And we should know what was the knowledge about the Antarctic that time in the end of the 19th century. As I have told you, that knowledge was not so wide, poor rather, because we have the observation of Edward Dahlmann, that was a German sailor that on a ship Greenland in 70s reached the eastern coast of Antarctic Peninsula, and we have the Norwegian Carl Larsen, who reached the Graham Land. It's the northern part of the Antarctic Peninsula. That was on Jason ship. And those two expeditions gave the people some kind of a knowledge about the new unknown land, as the Antarctic was. So that was not that there were some data, but maybe not efficient. But de Gerlache, organizing the expedition, was aware of it, and he used it with the planning of the expedition. The aim was, of course, the areas of Antarctic Peninsula. They planned to reach the unknown lands and put it on a map. But yeah, the reality was a little bit different. But we know that de Gerlache, based on the Friedrichsen map, that was a doctor that worked in Hamburg in Geographical Society as a secretary, and he gained the knowledge from Dahlmann and from Larsen, took his observations, materials, and so on, and prepared the map of the areas of Antarctic Peninsula. Of course, it's not that map, it's modern one, because we have wide knowledge about the continent and the areas around the continent right now. But that time the knowledge was rather poor. So every expedition that was organized that time based on the Friedrichsen map that was created in 90s. And we have the milestones of the expedition. So the beginning was in Antwerp in Belgium in August. As I said, the atmosphere was great. People were very happy because the first expedition, yes, the Belgian one, it was something unique, something unusual. So the staff were in a very good mood, and they spent some time in Southern America. They met with, for example, some Belgians living in the South America and Rio de Janeiro. There was a stop as well in Montevideo. Amundsen wrote in his diary that he is so impressed that in Southern America, in one place, they met so many beautiful women. Remember that times the expedition was organized and only by men, and the man was the participants, because nobody could even imagine that women can act as polar explorers or could work in a scientific field. I mean the polar connected with the polar scientific research. That was not so common. So yeah, the observation about the women was very important because they were expecting to spend some time in the Antarctic alone. In another year, they reached in January in the beginning the Graham Land, so it was the territory that was marked on the map, so it's nothing new, let's say. But there was an unhappy accident that occurred to Karl Vienke. He was a Belgian sailor, and he just fell into the water during the storm. The crew tried to help him, but it was impossible. The waves were so high, and he died during the expedition. That was their first victim. In February, the expedition reached the Antarctic Circle. So that was the border of the border to the New World. that was not discovered yet. So there was that was a very enthusiastic moment. But only after the crossing the Antarctic Circle, there was a breakdown, which was the stacking of the vessel in the pack ice. Yes. De Gerlache found at first that it's only an accident and they could release the vessel from the ice, but it was impossible. So they decided to overwinter in the Antarctic. As I said, it was not planned. They only wanted to reach the unknown lands, take some samples, prepared materials, maps, so on, then return to the Southern America for the food supply, to overwinter in South America, and only after that, if the weather, moods, finances permitted, they return again to the Antarctic. That was the plan, but there is no plan when you are stuck in the pack ice. So they decided, they had any other choice to spend the wintering in the Antarctic. It was a very tough decision, but there was no other option. So the situation was very severe. The temperatures reached -37. There were not enough food supply. They hadn't enough winter clothes. So people were ill, like Emil Danko, who died on a ship during the wintering. But Emil Danko was a very young person. He was a sailor, Belgian sailor, that was responsible for the geophysical observation of the magnetic field of the Earth. He was a military later on, but he anyway had some health problems with the heart. De Gerlache known about this, but decided to took Danko on board anyway. But unfortunately, because of the malnutrition, other difficult condition connected with the living on a ship in the ice, Emil Danko was very ill and he died. Amundsen wrote in his diaries that he was in a very good mood. He was aware that he is going to die and there is nothing that the staff could do with his situation, and he remained very optimistic till the end. That was very important because the mood on a ship was terrible. People were depressed. The death of Emil Danko and the cat, Nansen the cat, was that milestones where people get very bad in a mental meaning. So everybody expected that would be the end of the expedition and everybody would die. But in the beginning of the new year, 1899, there was a hope that they can remove the ship from the ice, but there was also the risk about the next wintering, because de Gerlache was not so sure if it would be possible to release the ship. In February and March, for whole month, they were working on preparing a channel in the pack ice using dynamites, using other tools. And when the channel was finished, the ship very slowly went through this channel to the open waters. So they were free, and in November this year they reached Antwerp. Of course, everybody in the end were very enthusiastic because the expedition, despite of many troubles, problems and disasters, was a great success. So the Belgica ship was stuck in the pack ice in the Bellingshausen Sea. It's not a very precisely marked point where the ship was stuck, but it's like an information that it was in that area. We also should imagine that there was a polar night from May till July, and those people on board had to survive in that very severe and strong condition. But it was the first wintering in the Antarctic. I think that nobody expected this, because they were, as I told you, planning only the expedition during the summer period, not for the wintering. Nobody could even imagine the winter in the Antarctic, but the fate was different. So the other let's say decided about the aim of that expedition, not necessarily the Gerlache. Difficulties, because if we achieve some goals, we should go through some difficulties, problems first. So among the difficulties, we can tell about the improper preparation before the expedition. They had not enough food supply. They had no winter clothes. Yes, of course, they had some warm clothes, but they were not designed especially for the winter period, for wintering in the Antarctic. Amundsen wrote that by an accident, he found on a ship in the other packs the gift that the staff were given in Belgium, and inside there were some sweatshirts for every member of the expedition. So it was like, wow, something very unusual to find such kind of a gift, and the atmosphere improved that day, and of course Amundsen marked it in his diaries. Diseases, malnutrition, scurvy. Scurvy is that kind of disease caused by lack of the vitamin C. When you lose your teeth, have bleeding gums, and lose your hair, for example. And of course, scurvy is very serious disease, and you can die if you are ill and don't have special treatment. Of course, people know what scurvy is and how to cope with it, but in the end of the 19th century, the pills with the vitamin C was not invented yet, so there were other methods how to cope with scurvy, but that was at first some problems with the Gerlache attitude, because I have told you that the expedition had problems with the cook, because he cooked very bad, and many people had some digestive problems with the stomach. And that's why the Gerlache decided to, at first, replace the cook. Okay, if some of you are leaving and have to leave, I'm very glad that you join us. And I hope that we will see again during the next classes. And the Gerlache decided, because when they were in the Antarctic, stuck in the pack ice, the fresh source of the food were penguins and seals. And Amundsen, with the cook, told the Gerlache to use that fresh meat to prepare some dishes for the staff. But the Gerlache refused, because he remembered the situation with the cook when everybody had problems with the stomach. So, but there was some critical moment when the Gerlache and Lecointe were so ill and so weak that Cook and Amundsen took over the leader's position and took care as well of the Gerlache and Lecointe. Those two guys even wrote their last wills because they thought they died during the expedition. And when Amundsen and Cook became the leaders, they decided to change the treatment for the ill person, for the ill members of the staff. And for example, they ordered to eat fresh meat, and there were not problems with scurvy anymore. They ordered to take up some physical exercises. For example, going skiing around the ship on the pack ice, sitting near the stove because it helped people to get better. There were many observations and many ways of treatment ordered by Cook and Amundsen, and they wrote about this in their diaries. Mental diseases. Adam Tollefsen was that guy who went mad during the expedition, and he died very soon when the expedition came back Europe. Some of the members had mental problems as well, and till the end of their lives they were under the special treatment, and almost everybody had hallucinations. That was caused by the monotony, polar nights, being in a close group. Amundsen wrote about this very precisely. I was amazed that how using simple and precise words, he described those behaviors. The monotony was the factor that was very annoying. For example, many notes from the diary of Amundsen started like this: the wind is blowing from the southwest and it is minus 31 degrees. Today I saw a padogroma. The ice has frozen over everywhere. It's like this. It's nothing new. Every day was the same. So, So if you think that those polar expeditions was full of adventures, unusual moments and so on, they were, but every single day was the same. And the aim of every day was to survive. So the monotony, it's something that normal person living in a modern world can even imagine. And of course they had strong weather conditions and the risk of second wintering. So that's why the Gerlache forced to make the channel to release the ship. And successes, of course, the discovery of new areas in the Antarctic. That was a brilliant achievement. On the maps was marked new territories, new lands, and so on. Observation of human behavior. That was that point I was telling about earlier. Those observations were made by mainly Amundsen and Cook. And that was a very good base for the polar explorers that organized another expeditions in the future, because nobody known till that time what will be the reaction of the human organisms towards the polar night, because it was something unusual for Europeans, of course. Medical observation and coping with scurvy, that was the main aim of the Amundsen treatment. And it's interesting that he describes with many details his health condition. So it means that Amundsen was in a very good mental condition to make such an observations, because some of the staff couldn't do it. For example, Arctowski was in period of a few months was so weak that he couldn't do regularly the meteorological observations, and that's why the other members of the expeditions helped him doing it. But that was not a unique situation, because people helped each other, because that without it the expedition wouldn't be a success. So the observations of Amundsen was: my blood circulation is gradually improving, my pulse rate was 118. We know 8 penguins stick every day. That was the method of the treatment that was ordered by Amundsen. We walk regularly, and we regularly sit in the front of the stove. And of course, the researchers, for example, that were obtained data from all year round meteorological observations. That was very important, because that was a very rich material in many information. and the expedition took some samples of unknown kind of rocks, animals, even plants. So it was very important. And in the end, there is a photo. Sorry, I will look at the watch how much time we have. Okay, we are going back till the end of our We are going till the end of our presentation right now. So it is the photo taken at Arctowski Station during the summer season when I worked in that place. We had a lot of visits of some tourists from many countries, and one day we had a tourist from Fram ship, the Belgian tourists. Many of them were Belgian, and they decided to go to the Antarctica to remember the great achievement of Adrien de Gerlache. So they had a lot of questions about the Arctowski as a scientist, about the Polish station, and on that photo, unfortunately, I now didn't remember all of those people. What were their roles in that touristic tour and so on? But that girl on the right side with the sunglasses on her head is a granddaughter of Adrien de Gerlache. So that was a very nice meeting and the others, I suppose those two guys in the front are from the family of the Adrien de Gerlache. So that was a very great meeting. And if some of you are interested in Amundsen diaries, here are the information. What is the title of that work? I guess I can have the scan of the text, so if somebody is interested in it, just let me know and I will organize it. And okay, it's my email address if some of you will have some questions. I will stay here for 2 or 3 minutes more,